Thank you very much, everyone, for coming out. The weather has not been great, is not great, but I think, as Ron said, the topic is not only of interest, but of some importance. And as you might all know, this lecture series was planned and these topics were selected well before the events of the past month. What I'm going to do in my talk is I'm going to start off with some general comments about anti-Semitism and just where we have been and how we have measured it and how we have thought about it, etc. And then I'm going to ask if perhaps, I won't answer, we are now in some kind of inflection point in our relationship to anti-Semitism in North America. And of course, we won't know that until the future happens, but maybe I think I know people who are pondering that right now. So, and then what I will do is I will actually focus on the campus, because we are on the campus. And the university and the academy is a place where a lot of the current debates on anti-Semitism are taking place. If I say current, I mean quite current. There's no real academic literature on what's been happening the past month, but we will look at some texts. I almost never do this, but this will be a kind of a text study. We'll look at some texts by professors, by university administrators, by students, by some organizations to capture the flavor of what is going on, and we'll analyze those texts together. So, anti-Semitism. So there is a conventional approach to anti-Semitism, to the study of anti-Semitism that I and others have used. We look at similarities with other types of racism. I'm a comparativist. We look at anti-Black racism, Islamophobia, what have you. And we usually have well-known sets of indicators. I'll come to that. One of my earlier lectures, I used the term the usual suspects, which comes from the movie Casablanca, and others. There are some common indicators that we use to measure anti-Semitism. And I'll talk about those. We look at the trends over time. What were these percentages 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and now? And we try to make some inferences about the consequences of that. And that's what I've been doing for a long time. And I've written articles on that and published with the same set of tools. Of course, you always then now ask yourself, are my tools really doing the job? Are those indicators doing the job? And we can discuss that. So anti-Semitism has had an uptick in North America even before the past month. So you see there a photograph. This is in the United States. This is an armed guard in a synagogue in the United States a few years ago. So it's not the first time that there have been these tensions in terms of synagogue protection and whatnot. If you've been to Europe, you all know that every synagogue on Shabbat has armed guards, more than one, stationed outside them. In my synagogue in Montreal, there was ramped up security, and I use the example from the New Year's services 2019. There was a big poster on the front door, and it said, "Do not hold the door open for a stranger. This is not rude, it is being safe." If you think about it, you want a synagogue to be a welcoming sort of place. No, you got to be safe. And there were, in this case, 3 unarmed guards in front of our synagogue. So this is the new normal. What are the different measures that we use when we talk about anti-Semitism in some sort of empirical way? Well, there's ideologies. I'll come to some of those. Different ideologies are anti-Semitic in one way or another, often openly. Okay, and we'll talk about some of those. There are stereotypes. There's a large literature, scholarly literature on the stereotypes, which are anti-Semitic. By the way, some of those stereotypes are absolute lies, but some of them are complicated. They're partial truths, right? But they're stereotypes. And there's a literature on them, and we measure, they go up, we go down, and that's one of the tools we use. Overt discrimination. acts of violence, including murder, including hate speech, acts of discrimination, and overt prejudice. If you make a statement to someone, and that's actually a criminal, it's threatening of death. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill the Jews. These are actually crimes. So these are all overt discrimination. And if you're familiar, B'nai B'rith counts these every year. They get a tally. Some years it's higher, some years it's lower. Lately, it's been trending up. But these are the counts of overt acts of discrimination. Systemic discrimination is more subtle, where it's not so much an individual who says, kill the Jews or I hate the Jews, but there may be certain systems that penalize Jews, and I'll come to some of those later on. They have a legal dimension, so I'm glad Ron is here to help guide us through that. Economic data, very important. Earnings below expectations, acceptance in the workplace. Now, historically, this was a major problem. As some of you know, certain industries in Canada were quite closed to Jews, certain professions closed to Jews. The Jews managed to earn a decent living. We have the data, but were they always promoted as they should have been? It's another question. Now I would say they are. The evidence shows that they are in all previously closed areas. Acceptance in the workplace is interesting sociologically. What does that mean? Most Jews are accepted in the workplace. Come, let's have a drink after work. Let's get together and have a drink, or let's go out for coffee, or do you want to play some golf on the weekend? You're accepted. What's interesting is actually to ponder whether that's true for Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox Jews. So if there is some of that workplace discrimination or prejudice, it may be directed at a subgroup of Jews. In the same way, you're an Islamic woman, you're wearing the hijab, you're a Sikh wearing a turban. You want to go out for a drink? I mean, it's this new gray area for those who are very observant of their particular profession. Intermarriage data, another important measure. For many Jews, intermarriage data is horrific. It's deadly because they see it as a process that will cut down Jewish numbers. That's another talk. But in fact, it also is a measure of acceptance. Intermarriage goes up, rates go up. It means Jews are being accepted by others, including the dominant Anglo group. So, it's a double-edged kind of measure. Friendship networks. Who are your 3 best friends? Who are your 5 best friends? I've asked those questions to Jews, and you get an answer. And are they the same as your group? Now, there are lots of Jewish people in this room. I don't know if I should pose that question. Who are your 5 closest friends, and how many of them are Jewish people? You should know that, statistically, if it's a random choice model, none of them should be Jewish in Toronto. But my guess is many of them, if not all, will be, right? Intermarriage, residential concentration, another measure. Is it a measure of anti-Semitism? Once upon a time, Jews lived in certain areas because they had to. They weren't, a realtor would not sell them a property somewhere else, so they had to live. Now we know, by the way, that a lot of this residential concentration is voluntary. Jews can live wherever they want. Why are they living in Thornhill? Because many choose to live in Thornhill for whatever reason. Measures of representation. How many Jews are there in Parliament? At what levels? I spoke about some of this earlier on, but it's not just Parliament, it's in every elite strata that you can think of, every industry you can think of. How many Jews are there in the profession of medicine? Jews are well represented in the profession of medicine and have been for a long time. So you look at these various measures, and clearly the more Jews are represented, the better. In my last talk, I spoke about Jewish representation in the Canadian Army during, it wasn't the Canadian, the British Canadian Army during World War I. And the Jews received decorations for bravery above their expected average in terms of their numbers. Okay. Finally, and certainly not least, cultural and social factors, e.g. Microaggressions. These are very subtle measures. They're new measures. Now, I don't know if you all know what a microaggression is, but this is a very popular measure now for racism and racial prejudice, but it's not an overt thing. Okay? All you Jews are rich. That is not a microaggression. It is not. I'll give you an example of a microaggression, which I like to use. If I were to ask a student, let's call them Fredonian, make that up, it's a fake name, but I know the student well, I say, tell me, I'd like to try a good Fredonian restaurant. Can you recommend a good Fredonian restaurant for me? I have just committed a microaggression because I have assumed that just because my student is Fredonian, they would know where a good Fredonian restaurant is. I have stereotyped them. You see that? I have committed a microaggression. Right? Now, is this very serious? That's another question. I can think of other examples of racism and prejudice that are more serious than that, but that's a microaggression, and it goes on and on. So those are the various measures, some of which we'll come back to. Now there's newer conceptions. So it's true that until 1960s, we could argue that anti-Semitism was the major dominant fact of North American life. It was. And if there would have been a course like this, 80% of it would have been focused on anti-Semitism. That began to change in the 1960s. My colleague Harold Troper, sitting over there, actually wrote a book about how the 1960s were a decade of change in this regard. So, first, the discrimination was quite serious. You know, universities like McGill and U of T and certain faculties, Jews allegedly needed higher grades. I say allegedly because it's not written down, but we believe that to be the case. That's probably no longer the case. Jews could be denied accommodation and jobs or promotions in their field of interest. Nowadays, by the way, Asians suffer from the same sort of thing. Asians highly qualified for a job, but do you really want this person to be the head of the division? Maybe just the research director, but not the head of the whole division, right? That's a kind of discrimination. So change begins. Even today, though, there is a very real difference, we won't go into it, in the status of Jews post-Holocaust in Europe compared to North America. Europe, for a variety of reasons, has always been and still is closer to the Holocaust, although, and I will argue, and it's another lecture, the Holocaust remains a very central element in the mental gymnastics that Jews have as they make sense of the world around them in the discourse. The Holocaust lurks, for better or for worse. Never forget? No, Jews have yet to forget. Now, of course, we have a different set of paradigms. And you see the boycott, divest, sanction poster there. Israel's Zionism settler colonial paradigm is a dominant factor. We'll come back to that in terms of attacking Israel. Israel is a creature of a European settler colonial paradigm. Jews have suspect loyalties, the BDS movement, and there's tensions between hate speech and free speech, especially on campus. Campus really appreciates academic freedom. I appreciate academic freedom a great deal, but we will see shortly how this is now being challenged. There are also some other more subtle quasi-legal sorts of challenges. Banning kosher slaughter or male circumcision, it has been attempted in some European countries, not in Canada, as far as I know, but it has been attempted and even succeeded in some European countries. Is that anti-Semitic? If you're a strong, a very strong vegan, or animal rights person, and you think that kosher slaughter happens to be more painful or barbaric, and you want to oppose it, are you anti-Semitic? Come back to that later. That's where we are. The current context. So for many decades, the study of anti-Semitism was in decline. Absolutely. And it wasn't the main worry of the Jewish community. But that's changing. Now there's an ironic situation where Jews are doing well in most indicators, education, occupation, income. And frankly, in North America, we don't have Dreyfus affairs, no mass pogroms, no death camps, no Nuremberg laws, for sure. In fact, the laws go the other way. And there are prominent Jews everywhere. There are. Yet there are very troubling signs post-October 7th. What's going on? Is this a revival? And as some of you know, the incidents of anti-Semitism in the past month have largely quadrupled, right? in North America, England, etc. Is this a revival of an always latent anti-Semitism in the West? In other words, it's always been there, despite all of that news, the good news that I said, but it's been there in a latent form. And suddenly it's been revived. It's been dormant and now it's not. Or is this a brand new kind of inflection point, given the events that we've seen? That's the question to pose. And, you know, there are all sorts of ambivalent Trump signals, pro-Israel steps, but also dog whistles of support of QAnon, Charlottesville, Jews will not replace us. You remember all of these sorts of things. You know, in the 1920s, there was this kind of overt anti-Semitism. But recently, I don't think we saw people marching, Jews will not replace us. Maybe I'm wrong. There has been an increase in the number of US militant and extremist groups from 457 in 1999 to over 1,000. These are armed militias. And there's been an increase in their number, a significant increase. Some of them are small, could be 5 or 10 people. Some of this is, you know, some of them could be 100 or 200 armed militias. We can think of de jure and de facto anti-Semitism. And that's a fairly important distinction. De jure anti-Semitism results from explicit laws that penalize Jews, which there are not many in Canada. There's no real Nuremberg laws that I can identify affecting Jews, but also legal interpretation. You know, if the courts make an interpretation of a ambiguous statute. So we have debates on reasonable accommodation. You're all familiar with these debates, right? Religious holidays. To what extent should the courts accommodate religious holidays? Maybe it depends on the holiday, but this is a debate where often courts will interpret situations. McGill University, my alma mater, used to have classes Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. Saturday class. What's that going to do for an Orthodox student who can't make it to the Saturday class or write an exam there? So there's been progress there. For example, now there is a list of religions whereby a McGill student cannot be victimized. I'm sure U of T has the same list. McGill has an enormously long list. Thank God. But I always ask my classes if there is a Wiccan in the class. I want to reassure them that if they are Wiccan, McGill will recognize their holidays. I will recognize their holidays. I may want to learn more about Wicca, but that's neither here nor there. But so there's been some progress on the reasonable accommodation front. Hate speech versus free speech. Again, the courts will have to resolve that. When students ask me, how will we solve problem X? How will we solve problem Y? Who's going to decide if this is hate speech or the answer is our courts will make that decision. For better or for worse. Some people don't like that. They prefer Parliament to make those decisions. But by and large, a lot of these decisions will be made by the courts, which, if you think about it, you know, is not the worst solution possible. To decide, is this hate speech or is this a free speech case? What's the boundary? The courts decide that. I'll give an example in a moment. De facto, dead bodies, actions that don't necessarily have legal sanction. Counting dead bodies is a good indicator. A lot of sociologists don't do that, but I do. In the United States, the famous case of Leo Frank began this process, and more recently, you see that photograph there. That's a photograph of the Pittsburgh shul called the Tree of Life. There's a shooting of Jews. There are Jews that have been killed in the United States. I've been trying to think if there had been something similar in Canada. Well, that Muslims have been killed, but not really a mass shooting of Jews in a synagogue yet. All right. There have been acts of vandalism, hate speech, threats. All of these are counted by B'nai B'rith. And again, people watch if they go up, watch if they go down. Lately, they've been going up. Lately, they have been going up. Another way we measure anti-Semitism, a key way, is through surveys. The gold standard is the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League survey. And every year, a group of countries, some every year, some other years, are asked questions. This is to the general public, not to the Jewish public, about attitudes on things that relate to anti-Semitism. So the ADL survey, and it's given to countries all over the planet, okay? 11 items, 11 attitude items. I've just given some of them here. Jews have too much economic power. Jews are more loyal to Israel than to your country. Jews control the media. Jews don't care what happens to anyone but their own kind. Jews talk too much about what happened to them in the Holocaust. I met some Jewish educators who actually would agree with the last thing, that Jewish education has become Holocaust-centric. Is that a good thing? We can debate that. But that's the point. There's 11 of these things, and here's the kicker. If you agree with 6 of the 11, you are an anti-Semite. Right? They don't measure the items, they measure you. If you agree with 5, you're okay. You're not an anti-Semite. And if you agree with 11 or you agree with 6, I guess you're still counted as the same anti-Semite. All right? I can tell you the results over many years of these questions because they don't change that much. The least anti-Semitic places using this instrument are places like Holland and Britain. They are often in single digit, high single digit, low double digit. Canada and the US, often in low or middle and upper teens. That's where we shake down. I know every year, go up a little, go down a little, okay. Then Western Europe is interesting. Countries like France and Germany and Austria and all those countries, there you're talking, could be in the 20s and 30% anti-Semitic. Eastern Europe, Poland, Ukraine, Romania, Hungary, Russia, those countries tend to be around 50 to 60% scoring yes. And then you get to the Middle East or Asian countries. The Middle East, the Asian countries, and many of them are Muslim countries, as you know. There you get up to 80 or 90% who agree with those, with at least 6 of those items. So that's one measure we have. Is it a great measure? Is it a reliable measure? I mentioned, I think in a previous lecture, that my bias as a sociologist is I'm a behaviorist. So attitudes are very interesting and important, but I also like to look at behaviors. What do people do? What does the country do? How is the country behaved? And Germany is an interesting case. We could talk about that later. Okay. Now, you could also measure it by surveying Jews about perceived discrimination. Ask a Jew, have you been a victim? Do you perceive? How serious a problem is discrimination? And by and large, the Bob Grimm survey 2018, 21% said yes, by religion, these are Jews, 18% by ethnicity and culture. In the United States, the Pew survey of 2020 found 43% said, yes, there is a lot of discrimination against Jews. Now, you could say to me, what do you mean by a lot? What does a lot mean? I'm not certain, because people aren't told what a lot means. Now, if you think there is a lot, that's fine. And what a survey will do is wash out the differences. So if a lot of people say, yes, there is a lot, that's fine. It doesn't matter how each of us defines that. But that's one kind of relationship set of questions, right? How Jews perceive the non-Jew, the other, and how the others perceive the Jews. Which is interesting if you look at friendship networks, which I like to look at. I told you who are your 5 closest friends, right? There are other variants of that question. How diverse is it? Comfort level. There's interesting questions. How comfortable are you with group X, group Y, and including Jews? Are you comfortable? Now, is comfortable, if I'm not comfortable with group X, am I a bigot? I just don't feel comfortable with group X, with their culture, with their styles, with their values. It's fine for them, but I'm not comfortable with it. If we were to ask Jewish people, how comfortable are you with non-Jewish people? We might get an interesting range of responses. I think there are some Jewish people who would also say, no, I'm not really comfortable. I don't feel comfortable. Marshall Sclair, who is the founder of Sociology of Jews, had an interesting term for that. He called it the ambassadorial role. What is that? In the post-war period, for the first time, Jews moved out to the suburbs, and they encountered a fair number of non-Jews, backyard to backyard, wherever they would get. And were the Jews really comfortable? They had left the ghettos of the inner city, where it's all Jewish, Kensington, Lower East Side. All of a sudden, were they comfortable? Jewish issues, but show you can really blend in. He called it the ambassadorial role. I have no idea if that still exists in the interactions between Jews and non-Jews. One way to test that would be to look at the interactions in the past month between Jews and non-Jews. To what extent have non-Jewish friends of Jews really been able to understand what many Jews are going through and been able to reach out or have reached out? How are you doing? I pose that question, all right? So, extreme ideological anti-Semitism, there's religious anti-Semitism, the Jews killed Christ, all right? That's religious anti-Semitism, not very common yet. Racist anti-Semitism, this is the Nazi example. The Jews were really biologically different. You can trace that back to the Spanish Inquisition, but certainly it flowers again in the case of Germany. The Jews are a different race. They're a different people, biologically different. They're not trustworthy. They're just different. Right-wing anti-Semitism and left-wing anti-Semitism are more common. You see their pictures. Right-wing anti-Semitism. Jews are communists. Jews are liberals. And you have George Soros in that photograph manipulating. I guess this is a Russian and American. The Jews are involved in the secret manipulation. George Soros. And of course, if you're into right-wing anti-Semitism, you believe in traditional values. You believe in the church. You believe in the tradition of our country and all of that. Then, you have Rothschild. The Jews are capitalists. They're exploiters. They're rich. They're Rothschild. So it's Rothschild or Soros. You can take your pick. Those are extreme and ideological anti-Semitism. How do you reconcile conflicting themes? The answer is conspiracy. The key to understanding all of this is conspiracy. It goes back, of course, to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in 1897. Jewish conspiracies to control the world. That's why there's no problem if you have religious Jews and Orthodox Jews and left-wing Jews and right-wing Jews. They're so different. How does that make sense? It makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. Made sense from Henry Ford to the, Dearborn Independent to some Arab countries. 9/11. 9/11. Right? Were Jews told they had a secret message? Each Jew got a secret call not to go to work if they worked in the trade centers. It's all a big conspiracy. They're all in it together. That's a foundational source of anti-Semitism. Just foundational. And and you can never disprove a conspiracy. I hope you're aware that that's the advantage of a conspiracy. You can never disprove it. The minute you bring some evidence, say, hey, wait a minute, you're saying X, but look, the New York Times says something different. Why? The Times is part of the Jewish conspiracy. Don't trust what you read there. You can never disprove a conspiracy. I read an article in the New York Times that said the Jews did not get secret warnings from 9/11. That's the New York Times. It's a Jewish newspaper. It's part of the conspiracy. You can't disprove it. Holocaust denial. Also related to this, and I'm going to just give an example of this from my own personal case. Many years ago, I was an expert witness in British Columbia against a fellow named Doug Collins. Some of you may know the name from British Columbia. He was a major anti-Semite and racist in British Columbia. He wrote a column in a newspaper called Swindler's List. The title of his column tells you its content. It was a Holocaust denial column, but also was a conspiracy column. It says the Jews have taken the myth of the Holocaust and used it to control Hollywood. That was his argument. So I went there and I testified that in fact this was anti-Semitic, and the judge of this human rights tribunal agreed with me with one. She said, yes, it is anti-Semitic. Agreed. Yes, it is hurtful. But she felt it did not rise to a sufficiently high level of hurt or anti-Semitism, and therefore she did not find against it because it was satirical, it was a little bit creative, right? There you go. Had he said, kill the Jews, no problem, but he didn't say that. He wrote Swindler's List. There's a big debate, more in Canada than the United States, on hate speech. Swindle case, the Kickster case, the Academy now wrestles with this stuff. You know that in the United States, there is a regime of free speech. So if the New York Times tomorrow decides to publish an editorial saying, the Holocaust really is a myth, it never happened. That's free speech. You cannot take an action against the New York Times. However, in Canada, if the Globe and Mail decided to write that kind of it is actionable. You could take an action. Not saying you would succeed, but you certainly could take an action. So the Academy is the new setting for all of these kinds of subtle and not so subtle debates. What is hate speech? What is not hate speech? And again, Canada and the United States differ to a certain extent on the limits of free speech, which we can discuss later. It's an interesting topic. The newest major issue, of course, is Israel, the Middle East, and Zionism. This is where we are now. What does anti-Zionism mean? Is it different from a critique of Israeli policies? This was debated well before the BDS campaign and even the apartheid campaign. Criticize Israeli policies. There's so many Israelis that criticize Israeli policies. What's the difference? There are Jewish activists in the BDS campaign and in the current crisis supporting the Palestinian cause. You may know that if you've been reading the literature, reading newspaper accounts. There are Jewish organizations that support the Palestinian cause. Not necessarily Hamas, but the Palestinian cause. How does one interpret that posture? Notice I'm not answering these questions. Now, for many North American Jews, these campaigns are anti-Semitic in their consequence, if not in motivation. What does that mean? And this is important, by the way, in contemporary studies of racism and prejudice. Consequence versus motivation. If someone discriminates against a person in a wheelchair by accident, or it discriminates against someone who is gay by accident, right? So you could say, you know, your actions have a harmful consequence, regardless of your motive. And a lot of times in the EDI processes, we focus on consequences. We can't analyze the internal workings of someone's mind. That's hard to do. But does this action cause harm to the group? Does the group think they are harmed by it? Right? Does the minority group think they are harmed by it? That's an anti-Semitism in terms of consequence, less in terms of motivation. So in a sense, when people are free to ask, well, are those Jews who reject Israel's right to exist partially, are they motivated by anti-Semitism? You can pose that question. It's not clear, how far you'll get. There are many ultra-Orthodox Jews, as you know, who oppose Israel's right to exist. But you can pose those questions. But really, the interesting area now is consequences. Is the campus a safe space for Jewish students? Now I'm shifting into our discussion of the campus. By the way, there are Jewish newspapers, I'm sure you know, that rank universities in terms of the degree of anti-Semitism that students report, right? There are newspapers, and I have news for you that both McGill and U of T rank badly in those surveys. There's a lot, and this is way before these events. Anti-Semitism has been an interesting issue, aside in Toronto universities, York, U of T, at McGill and Concordia. They have been real. I know that because students have come to my office seeking advice or a safe space or what have you. So let's take a look at these sorts of things. What is anti-Semitism? You've all heard of the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's definition, 2016. They gave a definition in 2016, which has been picked up by many, many political groups, including the province of Ontario. So this is an interesting lead-up, and it's worth pondering the text. Manifestations of anti-Semitism might include the targeting of the state of Israel. Notice might include. When do they? When don't they? We don't know. Might include conceived as a Jewish collectivity. However, criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitism. So if you want to criticize Israeli policies against its Arab population, you can also criticize Canada's policies against our indigenous population. Would that mean that that's okay? Because you can criticize many countries along the same lines. This is important. And by the way, this definition, which is very popular, as many of you know, has 11 statements. 7 of them, and I printed them here, deal with Israel. 7 of the 11 of these statements that can be considered anti-Semitic deal with Israel, not with general anti-Semitism, but with Israel. Now, you see them here. We're running a little pressed for time, so I won't go over them, but you can get a sense, denying the Jewish people the right to self-determination by claiming the existence of the state of Israel is racist, applying double standards by requiring of Israel a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. That's an interesting one. I have heard many Israelis say that they want Israel to be held to a higher standard. You see what I'm saying there? That argument that Israel should not be held to a higher standard, maybe they should. I'm just putting it out there, okay? And so drawing comparisons of contemporary Israel to the Nazis. Now, if we had more time, I would go over something called the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. Some of you may know that in 2021, a group of scholars, Jewish scholars, other kinds of scholars, put out a response to the IHRA definition. Why? They weren't happy with it. Why? Because they felt that this definition conflated criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, and they felt that this would stifle legitimate criticism of Israel. So they came up with a very detailed response, which I will not read. By the way, you go online, then there was a detailed response to this response. So it goes on, almost Talmudic, sort of response to response to response. This document has as its purpose to make certain that criticism of Israel is not penalizing. That's what they're about. You can have a harsh criticism of Israel, but it should not be penalizing. More criticism of Israel. Now, I'll just read one of their little paragraphs, a few sentences, just to give you a flavor of this. Okay. And it's interesting. It is not anti-Semitic to support arrangements that accord full equality to all inhabitants, quote, between the river and the sea, unquote. Whether in two states, a binational state, federal state, or whatever. Now, this was written a few years ago when the phrase from the river to the sea did not have the baggage that it has now, right? So on the one hand, you see that could be a problem, legitimating it. On the other hand, when you say, when you have a new kind of arrangement, let's say a federal state or a binational state, for many Jews, this sounds horrific. Let me remind you that when the Oslo Accords were being passed and people like Shimon Peres and others were having a vision of what would happen to an Israel post-peace, there was talk of a federation, which is not the same as a single dominant state. Now, was Shimon Peres anti-Semitic? I doubt it. So it's interesting how we sort through these different kinds of positions at different times. Now, very quickly. So here's a letter from a McGill student. Actually, I have a former McGill student in the room, but I don't think she sent me this letter, okay? It's, hi, Professor, I wasn't quite sure who to send. This was sent to me the evening of the 8th of October the 8th. You can see it there. I was quite sure, I'm not quite sure who to send this to. I felt as though you were perhaps the person to start. I believe this post, I'll show you the post in a minute, is insensitive and dangerous. Political opinions aside, a McGill-affiliated club shouldn't be allowed to celebrate Hamas's atrocities and promote violence. So she's writing to me. I speak for many of my friends when I say this is quite scary to me. That's the word, scary. This student was scared, and she was not the only one, right? Thank you for listening. Hope all is well with you. And I'm now going to tell you that the McGill administration took action. We're going to look at that. And by the way, there's similar issues of controversial statements take place in other workplaces. If you read the newspapers, a doctor in a hospital says something, a high school teacher says something, and then they pay a price for whatever they have to say. All right. So this is the pro-Palestinian Facebook post that this student was upset with, and this student organization used the McGill name in this post. Right? Again, look, I want to be clear. There may be nothing wrong with this post. I'm just going to read the text. This is the way it appeared to a Jewish student. Last night, the resistance in Gaza led a heroic attack against the occupation that has taken 30 hostages. It's not clear. Their march toward liberation is as monumental as their rockets. The resistance will free the prisoners who've been facing a fascist threat by the occupation and liberate our land. We call on our people in Montreal and diaspora to celebrate this on Sunday, October 8th. And there was a big demonstration in Montreal, Sunday, October 8th, in support of this action. Okay? Now, this was the text that scared that previous Jewish student, right? Meanwhile, university administrations started to issue statements about these events. And there's a range of statements. So, for example, there's a place called Sciences Po, which is in Paris, and they had a statement from their administration. I'm just going to focus on the first line of this statement. Israel has been the target of a series of appalling terrorist attacks. So there's the use of the word terrorist attacks. Israel has been the target. Now that statement early on was a fairly explicit recognition of what happened. Now, again, there will be many students who are Islamic who will disagree with that, who'll still call it a unfortunate statement, unfortunate act of resistance. You see the difference there. But this was Sciences Po. Here's the first text from the McGill administration. And by the way, I'm not quibbling or arguing with any of these texts. University administrators are caught between a rock and a hard place. Many of them did not rise to the occasion, right? Because they felt this might exacerbate tensions on their campuses. I'm not necessarily going to second guess every university. Some have stepped up, some still have not. Yesterday's news of violent conflict in Israel and Gaza. So this is the day after. Notice the term, violent conflict. No terrorism, no act of aggression, whatever, has caused many of us to feel shaken. Global humanitarian crises affect us all. We care deeply about your wellness. And, you know, again, strong support for free association and free expression are rights we affirm. But these freedoms are not absolute. And the words we choose and how we communicate them matter. We are staunchly committed to building and sustaining a campus community. I saw many statements like that. You know, if it was a different kind of presentation, you know, you'd look at 100 such statements and analyze them. But here's one from my own university, which was not atypical for what came out at the time. All right. Second reply from the McGill administration. There was pushback against the first statement. Okay. So here's the second reply. Many people in the McGill community, and I include myself among them, this is the principal of McGill, new person, are deeply upset by the horrific attack by Hamas on Israel last weekend. You see the change in the wording. They're upset by it's not just conflict, by the attack of Hamas on Israel and the situation that has been unfolding since then. Recognizing that, but starting with the attack by Hamas on Israel. What did McGill do? What was the step that they took? You remember the nasty statement I read? Well, given the incendiary content of this group's recent post, I have directed the deputy provost to inform the student body that their use of the university's name is non-compliant. In other words, they must stop using McGill in their ads. That was the penalty. In other words, nothing more than that, but you cannot use the word McGill in your promotion of these various actions. But at least that was some step which caused backlash. I just want you to get a sense of the language here that's being used back and forth. Now, I'm going to read you something from a prominent Canadian university. This was a letter by a university administration on October the 11th, which is a few days after the event. And the letter, I'll just read the main. With news continuing to emerge detailing the atrocities from the terrorist attacks on Israel this weekend, I want to express heartfelt condolences to those in our community who are grieving. Next paragraph. As this conflict deepens and innocent civilians are caught in the tragic repercussions in Israel, Gaza, and elsewhere, the implications are distressing for those with families and friends affected. It's bad for people affected by Israel. It's also bad for people affected by Gaza. And the university joins individuals calling for a dialogue towards a peaceful resolution. I have read many comments like that. Right? So if you read that comment, how you react to it. Well, at this university, which is a major university in Canada, there was a furious rejection of this letter, because this letter was not seen as considerate enough for Palestinians. And you know, maybe that's a legitimate view. And so there was a big petition launched by professors, over 125 signed at least. And there were some nasty letters, which I have here, but I will not read, by tenured professors, really harshly criticizing Israel in this, not really talking about Hamas, but just criticizing Israel. So here is a response by a group. This is a petition of professors from the same university, October 25. They rejected the letter that I just read. That was not acceptable. The letter that I just, and so we affirm the right of the Palestinian people to freedom and sovereignty from Israeli occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid. That was the preamble to their letter. It's a long letter. I'm just going to point out that they issued some demands for the administration. You can see them there. Rectify the statement that I just read you and condemn Israeli state violence and violations of international humanitarian law. And there may very well have been violations of international humanitarian law. But I'm just giving you a sense of what they wrote. Publicly denounce and actively prevent attempts to silence, demonize, or harass any student, staff, or faculty for expressing their solidarity or support for justice in Palestine. This is often called a new McCarthyism on campus, where if you defend Palestinians, if you defend Palestinians, you'll get shut down by the administration. Right? We reiterate the university's full commitment to my battery is running low, to academic freedom. Okay.
It's still working.
Still working, yeah. Okay, I'll just press close.
Just close it. I'll come back with
Okay, it's fine. I just have a few more minutes.
Okay.
Okay. Provide meaningful support to all faculty, staff, and students who are subject to or harassed in class on campus as a result of their support for justice in Palestine. Now, this was part of that large petition signed by at least 125 faculty members and more than 1,000 students. There have been similar sorts of statements for many universities. I brought this because it's Canadian, and this is a serious university. All right, so here's the third McGill message. Just came recently. Why is there a third McGill message? It's in the first line. In recent weeks, we have heard reports of intimidation, doxing, and other threatening behaviors targeting McGillians. So this is not some anonymous stuff. These are McGill administrators saying this has been going on and we would like it to stop. These hostilities are unacceptable and must stop. How will the universities get them to stop? I am not certain, because I think that passions are strongly held on both sides. So maybe people here have an idea. Canadian Friends of Peace Now is an interesting group. They're a progressive group. And on October 13th, and you all know that they support the right of Israel to exist, but they've been opposed to the settlements. So they are similar to many progressive Zionist groups, progressive Jewish groups, who are trying to navigate a position right now in this delicate period. Israel has the right and responsibility to strike a decisive blow against Hamas, to weaken it and to deter other enemies from joining the fray. So Israel has the right and responsibility. However, nevertheless, Israel must also do all it can to minimize civilian casualties and to safeguard the lives of the hostages. And this is well before the calls for the ceasefire and the corridors and all that. So this is a progressive group that was trying to navigate a position, and well, I'll point this out at the concluding issues. And I just picked because there are other groups that you could have looked at. This is a Canadian group, Canadian Friends of Peace Now. All right. So what are the concluding issues? Many progressive Jews and Zionists feeling deeply let down by their allies are also divided about their posture to take regarding Israel and the Gaza invasion. How do you navigate that? How do you navigate that? And I'm speaking now about Jews who are Zionists or progressive Jews who identify with Israel but may feel conflicted, but they're very, very upset. And there are articles that have been written about this by the lack of support, lack of empathy from their colleagues. Is anti-Zionism, and Michelle Goldberg in the New York Times is a good example of that. Is anti-Zionism or a harsh critique of Israel a form of anti-Semitism? What is anti-Zionism? To me, I think it's the argument that Israel has no right to exist as an independent Jewish state. But is that a form of anti-Semitism? A harsh critique of Israel? I would say it could be a form of anti-Semitism. Who decides that? Who decides how harsh is harsh? I think it'll be if it goes that way, it goes to the judicial system. Do we define anti-Semitism by consequence or motivation, which is what I posed before? And there is a current debate in academia. Now, many of you have heard of the culture wars. The culture wars have been raging for some time in the campus. You've heard the term woke. You've heard, these debates between left and right, between, those who are more progressive and those who are not progressive enough. Well, in academia, especially in the humanities and social sciences, there are competing paradigms. And one of the major paradigms which labels Jews negatively is the settler colonial paradigm. That Israel is a settler colonial state. By the way, so is Canada, but never mind. Israel is a settler colonial state and therefore is guilty, by definition, of oppression of the Palestinians. No ifs, ands, or buts. Do we want to focus? Do people who are worried about anti-Semitism want to focus on the student behaviors or on the professors? I gave those examples from that university. A lot of people claim that students are influenced by professors. Who knows? And finally, what are the limits on free speech, especially in academia? And they are in a state of flux. But I can tell you, and I'll stop at this note, that in the world of EDI and anti-racism, which I've been involved with, the general practice is now to pay attention and to listen to the perceptions of the victimized group. If members of the victimized group say, we think this policy is hurting our group, we don't dismiss that. We listen to it, we ponder it, and we generally tend to give it credence. But I think that that's something that is not given to Zionists the same way. It may be given to other groups, which is fine, racialized minorities, LGBTQ, women, we feel that X is sexist. We feel we have been harmed by X. Well, many Jews on campus apparently feel that they have been harmed as well. They are being harmed. I read you the letter from that student, right, who was scared. I just want to give you a taste of that. So I'm going to stop here and deliberately stop with more questions, I hope, than answers. But I think the question remains, is all of this a new inflection point for Jews in North America?